Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I'd like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video is going to be on how to tell the difference between being highly creative and having a personality disorder. And the reason I want to talk about this is because I think that it would be very likely that a creative person, a highly creative person, in the sense of having the right temperamental variances, which I'll talk about shortly, may confuse themselves with being someone who has a personality disorder, particularly because they probably experience a certain set of thoughts, emotions, attitudes, and inclinations that they're just not going to find ubiquitous across any population. They're not going to find very many people that are like them. And about the only other people that they seem to feel similar to are, people with personality disorders, which is why you find people with personality disorders, particularly bipolar mood disorder and various other um, personality disorders within creative communities, art communities, and music communities, and things like that, because there is a correlation between personality disorders and openness to experience. That's something that's true from a psychological standpoint, but the evidence that creativity and madness go hand in hand is not necessarily, it's inconclusive. So you can't say that it's true, you can't say that it's not true, but there doesn't seem to be good. There seems to be evidence to show that the more unstable a personality becomes, the less likely they're going to be creative, because in order to be creative, you have to be somewhat industrious and you have to work on things, and so you can't really work on things whenever you're screaming in a corner, crying, and won't come out. So that's the deal. Even artists with personality disorders, they're only productive when they're not experiencing what psychologists would call the positive aspects of that disorder. And positive doesn't mean good in this case. So, with that said, I think that because of this, people who are highly creative have perhaps a tendency, because of the lore around creativity, to either think that they have a personality disorder or they're a genius, which both are problematic ways of thinking about being a highly creative person. But I'm going to stick with the personality disorder part in this video and maybe talk about the other thing another time. But part of the reason why you may assume that you have a personality disorder as a creative person is because your constellation of traits centering around openness to experience are usually the extremes of representations of any personality dimension. There's competing literature out there about the extremes of personality dimensions. Some people have the idea that any personality disorder, or all of the personality disorders that you find within the DSM, can be localized to some big five dimension in the extreme over representation of it or under representation of it. And there's competing literature whether or not that's valid or not. To be frank, I'm not up to date on it, so I can't really say where the science is. But because of this, there has been even more research in personality theory to note that personality, whenever you get over the 75th percentile for any kind of personality dimension, you're looking at someone who is weird. They're strange. They're not typical. And this weird or the strange or not typical is more than just a category of the mind from the standpoint of what this person's experiences from a phenomenological standpoint. It is not normative, and they are not neurotypical. If you were to gather these people, this hasn't been done enough, but it's been done enough times to get the hypothesis and the inclination that if you were to gather all of these people and stick them under MRIs and place them under EEGs, you'd see that they just don't have the same kind of neurological consistency going on in their minds. Doesn't mean that their brains are all that different from another person, though they're, depending on whatever they do with their time and whatever experiences that they've had in their lives, there may be differing neuro phrenology going on with their brain, but that those aren't necessarily always the same things, because neurochemistry and neurological happening is something that's controlled on a cellular level rather than a grand or more macro anatomical level. So you're going to see, but all those cellular and neurochemical uh, phenomena can be seen with fMRI through blood flow and oxygen and various things like that, and EEGs, because of it's following the electrical chemical activity, and so you can see those things indirectly. So that's why those things aren't necessarily the same thing, because when you're talking about neurophonology, you're talking about anatomical structure. When you're talking about neuro phenomenology, then you're talking about cellular neurochemistry and all neurochemistry and cellular levels, things that go down to astrocytes, glial cells, all other sorts, the white matter density, fidelity, all these other sorts of things. So with that said, that's what you'd find with these individuals. And so people definitely think that, well, what is personality really? And personality, from the standpoint of, I guess, as a neurological aspect, or something that pertains to neuroscience, can be understood from the affective standpoint, roughly. So whenever you're looking at something like a trait, openness, and this isn't completely uh, codified in any literature, I'm just putting this together from various sources. Whenever you look at a trait like openness to experience, you're looking at something like a constellation of certain cognitive factors and motivational factors. So, for example, open people tend to like novelty, and they tend to be sensitive to the emotional happenings within themselves. So, whenever you're looking at an open person, you are seeing that, well, whenever you talk about those two things, let's stick with novelty, you're usually dealing with the reward network, or a certain aspect of the reward network, for the same reason that people like to go exploring, or for the same thing that drives curiosity. That's the same network that's instigating the taste for novelty. Now, is it completely that? No, because for some reason too, openness seems to be interested in abstraction, and open people seem to be more adept at dealing with abstractions or depicting things in abstract ways. And so that has a lot to do with the right prefrontal region, where people are assuming, and the fact that they're prone to daydreaming, and the fact that they're very much so aware of their own subjective experience. That's what you can say, whether that's emotions or thoughts or whatever. That has something to do with their precuneus, or their default mode network. That's something that Scott Barry Kaufman has shown. And so when you're looking at openness to experience as a trait, if you're thinking of it from a neurological perspective, it seems to be a constellation of several neurological aspects. So perhaps whenever you're looking at, for example, somebody who is extremely something, you are looking at an extreme representation in the activities or the development of various cognitive attributes. And so that's consequential, just because the brain's self-organizing, and so it just never stays localized. It's one of the things that I talk about, I guess, in a Quora post I put on why is it the case that highly intelligent people are also weird or something. No, that's not the one. Why are highly intelligent people also antisocial? That was the Quora post. And I didn't say that highly intelligent people are necessarily antisocial. What I said is this, that whenever you think about the way nature works, you need to understand that nature is conservative. And so it's operating and organizing things on a budget, a very limited budget. And if it has maybe a quanta of things that is a magnitude of 50, if it gives 40 to one area, that means it only has 10 to share with everything else. So, because nature is conservative and it tends to work like this in this self organizing manner, if it selects for something that's atypical, it's not typical in the first place, it chooses to organize or engineer something to be done in an atypical manner, it will continue to do that because, in terms of the way in which its weighted probabilities go, you select atypical on your first draw, you're more likely to get atypical on your next draw. It doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case, but that just seems to be the case generally. For example, why is it the case that whenever IQ increases, you see an increase in what people call overexcitabilities? Now, I don't know about the scientific validity of overexcitabilities, but I do notice this, that when people tend to have high IQ, they also tend to have more extreme dimensions of their personalities as well. And this is just my own personal observation. You tend to find, and which is why I think that there's a correlation with, which is why I think people used to mistake the trait creativity for trait intelligence, because people who tend to be highly intelligent can also be high in openness to experience. That doesn't mean that everybody who's high in openness to experience is high in IQ. But if you have somebody who's high in trait openness, and then you could have somebody who's high in IQ. Similarly, if you have somebody who's high in IQ, you could have somebody who's high in trait openness. Or if you have somebody who's high in extroversion, then chances are they could be high in agreeableness. If they're low in extroversion, chances are they could be very low in agreeableness. And it depends on how high you're talking. It looks like when things get past the 75th percentile for anything like that, you start going towards extremes. That's just what it is for anything that you're measuring, period. In any case or scenario, that's the relatively normative statistical phenomena. That's when you start getting into your outliers. And so once you get over that, it looks like the way in which something is, when you're talking about an organism particularly, the way in which an organism is going to be organized is going to be idiosyncratic in and of itself. And you can see that in nature with other animals. Whenever they have extreme anatomical features, that's not the only interesting or funny thing about them from the standpoint of how their physiology operates in the world, but it's specialized towards whatever particular niches that are a part of the environment that they evolved in. So that's why they have those extremities in the first place. Human beings, however, just because we're also, I don't really know why, we're very general plastic things, but we do come with psychology into the world. So we have personality. And just like everything else has, I guess, a random crapshootish kind of nature and quality to it, personality can have the very same feature, a part of it. It's just one big dice roll. And sometimes nature rolls risky, or it rolls extreme, it rolls high. And so whenever you're looking at somebody who's highly creative, you're looking usually at a certain kind of personality. Now, all creative people do differ in their personalities, but how do creative people differ in their personalities? Creative people can differ in their personalities from the aspects of whether or not they're introverted versus being extroverted, or from the aspects of whether they're agreeable to being disagreeable. They can also vary in their conscientiousness and several facets of it, but they all seem to be keen on industriousness, which is a weird thing, but we're not gonna go there necessarily right now, but they can differ on their levels of conscientiousness. But they also, but that's about the only places that they differ, because the one thing you're gonna find with creative people is that they're open and neurotic. That's what they are. So whether or not they're extroverted or something like that is another thing, because that's the funny thing about, being more towards the creative disposition. That's the way I should put it. People who are highly creative, or at least people who have the profile of highly creative people, tend to be generally open and neurotic. They tend to be more so than the average person. Let's just put it like that. They tend to be highly open in their neuroticism. They're not low in neuroticism. That's one thing that you know, that they're not low in neuroticism, because a lack of neuroticism is basically apathy and a disinterested aspect or dispassionate feelings about the world. And the last thing a creative person is disinterested or dispassionate about themselves or things in the world. That's just not what they are. And also, neuroticism seems to have an interesting... So a lot of times people think that, extroverts are narcissists or something like that. Well, it is the case. So there's two ways you get self-interest, it looks like, from a cognitive standpoint. You can either have somebody be very extroverted. Dopamine tends to make people dig themselves for some reason. I'm not sure. Whenever we're dopaminergically lifted, we feel very high and supermanish, and that's where mania comes from. But whenever we're also, I suppose, feeling very neurotic or hyper stressed, we're also very self-interested. We're extremely self-sensitive and extremely self-aware. We're looking for how things are going to harm ourselves or do something to ourselves. So you find the case that creative people can be both. They can be very There's a funny... Well, it gets messy from a neurological standpoint, because openness to experience has a correlation with dopamine too. Open people tend to be more self-interested, from the standpoint of the way in which traits, I guess, organize themselves in the behavioral landscape. Open people, they dig themselves a little, and they have to, because you can't, they have to a certain extent, because you wouldn't be able to if you didn't like taste or satisfying yourself. Because open people, the reason why they move to Novelty is because they don't like being bored, or they don't really like situations staying consistent. They want to change situations and those environments to satisfy themselves. Now, it's not like that isn't what other personality types are doing, because extroverts are just around people to satisfy themselves. That's really it. Agreeable people get along with people or do things for people because they're satisfying themselves. Everyone's self-interested. It's just the case that whenever you get high extroverted self-interest and you have high open self-interest, that you get things that look like narcissism, or borderline personality disorder, or bipolar mood disorder. They have correlation in their attributes. Not saying that anybody that are these things that's what they are, but they look more like these people. They look more like these people, or they're like, if you have it, and they're also neurotic or something like that, then they look like a manic person, But they're like that in appearance, and they're like that in appearance in a limited sense. And so it's appearance rather than being, because there's a very big difference between looking like a manic person or having certain behaviors and symptomology, or the similar symptomology of a manic person, because somebody who's manic depressive is not aware of their mania. They're not aware of themselves or their states. I know people would say, well, whenever you look at human beings, it seems like we lack awareness in general. Well, from this standpoint, that when we talk about other human beings lacking awareness or something like that, that's why when you're talking about psychology and trying to define things in terms of psychology, it gets pretty messy, because it is all qualitative. What does it mean for somebody to be self-aware? That's the first thing. Somebody might wonder, well, from a psychological standpoint, it means they'll go to therapy. From psychological standpoint, it means you can convince them to go to therapy, or at least enough things they can learn from their actions or their mistakes. So you can take somebody who's very pig-headed and something like that, and they can experience enough trauma that will make them change. whenever you're dealing with a manic person, there it seems like there's not an exhaustion unless you put them on some kind of medication and serious supervision and cognitive behavioral therapy. It doesn't seem like enough trauma is going to get them to change their minds, or enough social disapproval or anything like that. It doesn't seem like they'll change their mind. It doesn't seem like they learn or update their behavior based on whatever happens to them in the world. They just keep chugging along no matter what, which is why they have high rates of mortality, or certain personality types have high rates of mortality. And that's not the only reason, because they also like to kill themselves, so that's another thing. But, that's another thing. But that is the difference between a highly creative person from a very obvious standpoint, I suppose, versus another person. Now, highly creative people are their own flavor of person, and so they can differ on a lot of dimensions, but the one thing that's true is that they're going to be relatively neurotic, and they're going to be high in openness to experience. Now, that because they're like this, they're very self-critical, typically. That's the one thing you can know about them, even if they dig themselves. So take Andy Warhol, for example. Even if they think they're the greatest thing since sliced bread, that's not the only thing that lives inside of them. Those aren't the only voices that are talking. Maybe that's what they show to the world, but that's not all that's going on inside of them. David Bowie liked himself and everything like that, but David Bowie also had, things, It's just that's the way it goes. I mean, it depends on who you're talking about, I guess, David Bowie was extremely extroverted. That's one thing to say about David Bowie, so who knows, I haven't read his biography or his journal or anything like that, but I do know Andy Warhol was neurotic as hell. Similar to Ludwig Boltzmann. Now, I'm not saying that creative people are just suicidal and destructive and things like that, but let's talk about what it takes to get a creative person. So I don't think everybody's going to be creative just because they're open and they're neurotic, because you can have an open and neurotic person that goes and be a yoga teacher or something like that. I honestly think you need an open and neurotic person that experiences trauma, and that's how you get a creative person. I'm not kidding. I don't think that, happy people become creative people. I think that you have it the case that there's a few factors, man. Like, they're trained at something, and then they have things that they see that they don't like, and they experience a lot of things that are problematic or something like that to them. Or they're nurtured to be creative. And from that standpoint, I mean that they come from a family of musicians or painters or something like that, and they happen to be born with enough IQ and open and neurotic such that they fit the bill, and that gets it done. So it's like a creative person, for them to emerge in the world, there's not a heterogeneous solution. Excuse me, there's not a homogeneous solution. It's a heterogeneous sort of phenomena, in the sense that you only need like the necessary ingredients, and then a few things just happen to work themselves out in certain ways. So, I mean, IQ tends to be a part of it, because it's the question of how prolifically creative are you going to be, and what domain are you going to be creative in. Now, you can be prolifically creative as an artist, and you don't have to have an extraordinarily high IQ. That may not win you anything, in fact. It may help you run your business better or something like that, or market yourself better or something like that, but I mean, I wouldn't say most marketing gurus are geniuses or anything like that. So, I mean, take that for what it's worth. I don't think really an IQ, I think an artist can have an IQ anywhere from 90 to 120, and they'll be just fine. If they have anything more than that, then that may help, but it's not going to really make the thing go for you. Because when I mean paint, when I'm thinking about this, I mean painting, sculpting, music, and things like that, various, let's just say, performing arts and visual arts and performing arts and visual artists, those kind of artists. I think that IQ may help, but it's not really what wins the day in the end, because that's the domain where openness shines forth. Openness and neuroticism, and I mean whatever other kinds of atypical personality dimensions you have, because I mean, persona really sells an artist. I mean, whether or not people are aware of this or not, it's not simply because Picasso had a lot of great work. It's also because Picasso had a certain personality that people really found Picasso's work in his life and himself very intriguing. And it's true about geniuses in general. They're intriguing as people, typically. Not all of them. I mean, that's not true for all of them. It depends on what domain you're talking about. But usually, when you're looking at artistic or creative geniuses, whether you're talking about Newton, I think Isaac Newton was a creative genius. Newton was an interesting fellow. That was a strange man, you know? That was a very, very strange man. And I think anytime you're looking at those kinds of people, that, yeah, they have a lot, you know, it's not just their IQ or something like that. That's not what really makes them. It's their personality, and it's personality that's disposed to have certain conditions initially that have things to do with openness and eroticism, and then whatever else arranges itself around them is just, you know, up for the kill or up for the draw. It's just how it is, and that's just going to make the thing even more interesting and enticing, because because the truth is, whenever you're looking at a highly open person who's also neurotic, you're looking at an unstable personality. I hate to break it to you. From the standpoint, from the standpoint of psychology, you're looking at an unstable personality, and so that doesn't mean that those people aren't happy and things like that, but you're at risk. I put it like that. It's not the case that you're necessarily at risk to have a personality disorder, but you're far, 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 far more at risk to have disadvantageous things happen to you, such as homelessness, such as suicide, such as, you know, early teen pregnancy, and all other sorts of things. I mean, like, and it's not necessarily IQ alone, which is the funny thing about this. Certainly socioeconomic factors tie into this, but the reason why these things are the case is because neurotic people are impulsive. That's a feature of neuroticism. And open people are risk-taking. And so when you take the fact that this person is relatively impulsive and they'll also take risk, that doesn't always get them in great places, which is why it's the case that I think whenever you have low IQ and you have high levels of openness to experience and neuroticism, it just looks like a personality disorder. It may not necessarily be a personality disorder, but it looks like a personality disorder because they have a learning disability and they do not have a personality that's going to keep them going like the straight and narrow. They're going to believe crazy things. They're going to do a lot of weird things. They're going to find themselves in strange communities, possibly parts of cults and all of those sorts of things. I mean, that's what you're looking at. And so, yeah, the personality itself sweeps itself towards chaos. That's the way that you can think. It sweeps itself towards chaos. That's what you can think about a creative person. It doesn't matter if they're extroverted. It may be actually harder if they're extroverted because they like people. And people have expectations of them and they want to get along with people and things like that, but they're well, let's just say they're not exactly a good gal or a good boy, you know? They're those kinds of, that's why creative people are always those kinds of people. They have certain appearances and things like that, or they can appear certain ways in various settings, but when it comes to what's going on inside of them and maybe some of the risks that they take and some of the taboos that they indulge in and some of the fetishes and various things like that they have, people would just kind of be like, oh, because look, it's not necessarily completely their personality that leads them to do or feel the certain things that they feel, but it's motivating them to go towards those things, whether they don't make that choice. It's just environment and a lot of things contribute to it, but it's just, if you didn't have that personality, it wouldn't happen in the first place. And that's why not everybody becomes an extraordinarily creative person, because, you know, just because everybody could be orphans, but not everybody's going to just suddenly become a creative genius because they're an orphan. However, if you take somebody like Edgar Allan Poe, who was very open and highly neurotic and all of those sorts of things, you know, Edgar Allan Poe wasn't exactly a pleasing person and other dimensions and things like that. He was highly agreeable too, but also a very it's weird. So this is the other thing about creative people. So when you look at personality has a personality dimension, like agreeableness. It has more than one facet. It has 6 facets, in fact. And I believe that extroversion has 7 facets, and they all have these various facets. So whenever you're looking at why, and now that we're talking about the facets, let's just go ahead and I'll get to industriousness after this. Whenever you're looking at an extremity in a person, you may not necessarily be looking at an extremity within that personality dimension. That you may not be looking at an extremity in the overall expression of that personality trait. You may be looking at an extremity in one dimension. For example, with me, as it pertains to conscientiousness, I'll do this slowly so that people can see. Okay, so there's books here, there's books here, there's books here, there's books everywhere. But notice how it's all a general mess. Like, if you look at my floor, there's my art books and things like that. This is my living room. And so there's my guitar, and God, there's my desk. It's like, notice how it's just all of, and I was vacuuming the other day. It's all a mess, right? So when it comes to trait conscientiousness, I am actually very low in it. But I'm extremely low in trait organization. This is not as messy as it can get. And I'm not going to show you my kitchen. But, I mean, and look, there's a pick here. I mean, I don't know. Like, if I look at it and evaluate it or something like that, I'm aware of what's going on. But I don't intentionally choose for my space to look like this. I don't stop to do anything about it whenever it happens to, at least on my kitchen, I guess. I don't do anything about it when it happens to turn out like this because I'm busy figuring out arguments against the Bible. I've read it like 4 times. I was an athlete, so I got that a long time ago. Studying math a lot or something like that. Even though I have a calculator here, I don't actually use it. I mean, more than to check my work. I'm just doing things. I'm always just doing things. So that's why my space gets disarrayed because I'm being more industrious than I am being organized. And so let's talk about conscientiousness, because really I'm not very conscientious, but I'm extremely conscientious in one dimension and one dimension alone, and you probably can guess what that is: industriousness. I'm way, 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 way more industrious than most people. That's why most people look like they're lazy to me. Because it's not actually hard for me to work on things. It's not actually hard for me to do things that I want to do. Now, because I'm like this, I also am a nuisance in school because people can very easily recognize that I'm very intelligent, I'm also creative, and I seem to be highly motivated to do several things. Why the hell won't he do what I ask him to do or his work? Because it doesn't make sense. And he's also very compassionate. So, compassionate towards people. But I'm actually not very agreeable. So, I'm high in the aspect of compassion when it comes to agreeableness. But when it comes to like extroversion, I have like moderate levels of gregariousness. I can be rather gregarious or something like that, but I'm not very extroverted. And so, I mean, when people look at me, they see a set of traits that they think, these things ought to mean this, but they don't mean, but they don't, and it's very confusing. And that's something that's true with creative people generally, because whenever you're looking at, well, how is it that their extremities are, unveiling themselves? Well, God knows, man. That's just gonna differ on an individual basis. But the one thing that you can be reasonably sure of is that you're a case of extremities, man. And those extremities can be everything from hyper representations to deficits. So whenever, you're talking about my lack of organization, I'm in the 10th percentile for the aspect of, or the facet of, organization when it comes to conscientiousness. And I don't know with respects to what population or anything like that, but I'm very, 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 very low. I'm very, very low. And so, when it comes to industriousness, there are several facets that comprise it. But in terms of all those facets, I mean, you know, whatever. It's just know that yes, yes for all of those things, no for any of the organization things. I'm not like I don't have high disgust sensitivity or anything like that. I'm not I'm not like this. I'm not like that. I keep my place relatively clean because I rent this place and my landlord would freak out, you know. But even she's accepted that, you know, this is as good as it's getting for the most part. So long as she can, you know, whatever. Yeah, so yeah, but I mean, you know, that's how it goes, and I'm just using myself as an example because I think that one of the things that was true about me whenever I was younger is I did think I had a personality disorder. So I think like, and even sometimes too, I still wonder, do I have ADHD or something like that? It's once you get openness to a certain level, it's very hard to discriminate beyond that, you know, your experience, because your experience in terms of whatever it is you're reading about these people and things like that, they may sound very similar, but just because you have the same symptoms does not mean they have the same etymology, you know, or yeah, etiology. They don't have the same. They don't necessarily derive from the same source. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say if you're highly creative, that it may be hard for you to organize yourself in certain ways. It may not be. You may be like Hitler, and you're also very organized while at the same time being very open and neurotic, which is a strange, you know, strange thing. But, um, yeah, anyways, it's the case that, well, that could be a thing for you. I mean, I guess to say this, like, Um, if you have a creative disposition, meaning that you're highly open and you're also neurotic, then that's not the only thing that's going on with you. And because you tend to think that there's something wrong with you, or you tend to think that there's something wrong generally with you or the world or something like that, you tend to move towards a problematic mindset. Like I just put it like that. You're looking for issues and problems. You could, unless you're very extroverted or something like that, and you feel very good about yourself, turn that eye on yourself in your behaviors and things like that. Especially if they get you into trouble, especially if it's the case that life isn't working out for you in certain ways, you definitely will start to turn that eye inward. And you may look for an explanation because whenever it's the case that you reference your normative landscape or the people you consistently or continually encounter, they don't seem to be like you. Unless you have a mother or a father that's similar to you. I mean, that's the case with some people. Some people don't feel crazy because they're like, well, my mom or my dad, and they have a family history and things like that. So maybe it's more so something that happened with somebody like me because I don't know anything about my family history. But I'm just saying that just because you're highly creative and you're eccentric and things like that doesn't mean that you have a personality disorder. It just means that you're strange. Like, and you know, being strange has its own adversities, but it's definitely the case that you shouldn't take medication and things like that. Now, I would say this. I don't think that if you were really a schizophrenic or you really had bipolar mood disorder, you had ADHD or something like that, that you perhaps if you're older or something like that, you can suspect that those things are true about yourself and seek help or something like that. But I think more so the case is that unless you know, are given certain psychometric batteries, because there are real, you know, you may, if you do suspect that you have any of these things, go talk to a licensed psychologist and sort this out. But I would say that if you do talk to that psychologist and they say, well, there's nothing wrong, or they seem like they have to really work to put you in certain categories, I would say this, that chances are you don't need medication. Chances are you need to organize yourself as a creative person. Now, what does it mean to organize yourself as a creative person? I don't know. That's something I'm working out my damn self. But I would say that it's a particular thing. It's specific, to each individual, and it's gonna be might be an uphill battle for you to figure it out. But I think that you can, and if you're not necessarily successful at whatever creative venture that you decide to pursue that's necessary for you to pursue, don't worry, man, because almost no one is. So maybe that means that you want to make different financial situations in terms of what you choose to pursue as your full-time job or something like that, and then yeah, go for it. But I mean, from the standpoint of, being a creative person, from the personality standpoint, is a certain kind of thing that's not really um, unnatural. It's just strange. And so you're just a weirdo, man. Everybody's weird in certain ways, but everybody says that they're weird, but everybody's not weird. Okay, so I mean, everybody does have variation on so many different dimensions or something like that, but you're socially weird. I just put it like that. So that's the way I would say you're weird. You have the weirdness that will get you in very many social realities that other people may not find very pleasant. And so maybe some interesting water for you to navigate. And so I would say that I'm just trying to give a general explanation for why, if you're a creative person, you probably don't have a personality disorder, unless, of course, you have a personality disorder, which would not just make you a creative person, but a creative person with a personality disorder. All people who have personality disorders are not creative people, and all creative people do not have personality disorders. Similarly, all creative people are not highly intelligent. Not all highly intelligent people. In fact, most highly intelligent people are not creative, which is funny. Not sure why that is, to be frank, but whatever. Anyway, that's another discussion. But it's the case that if you find yourself in various categories, then treat yourself appropriately. That's the thing that I would say. Treat yourself appropriately. And cut yourself some slack, in either of those ways, in either of these categories, because you didn't get to pick either. You're stuck with it. You're trapped with your existence. That doesn't mean you commit suicide and everything like that, because that's also why a lot of creative people commit suicide, because I think I'm not the first person to realize that, look, all of these impulses to go and do these risky things, or all of these impulses to try and do these lofty and ludicrous ideas and things like that, or to act out these visions and these goals. I don't know why the hell my mind centered around Newton or something like that. I don't know why it's centered around Einstein. A lot of people like Einstein. Not many people want to outdo Einstein, and I wouldn't say that I want to outdo him from the standpoint that I think I can. It's just like whenever I look at my motivations or something like that. I'm not saying it from a cognizant standpoint that I consciously think of these things, but I'm talking about my behavior. And I think if anybody looks at a creative person and their behavior, one thing that's true is that they're always grandstanding in some way, okay? And I don't mean to say that they're showing off or something like that, but creative people are much more lofty in their desire to achieve, do, and be. Their lofty exists in their persona or their makeup, and that has consequences. And so I'd say, given my tastes and things like that, I notice my the lofty affective aspects of myself tend to move me in certain directions where I feel like I'm being swept there or taken there. Not that I'm like really controlling them necessarily. And I think that a lot of creative people can feel that at various points in times in their life, depending on how stable their financial situation is and all other sorts of things, But I'd say that even though you feel that way, you're not helpless. You do control yourself. You can control yourself to a certain extent. Thus, you can organize yourself in your life and your creative endeavors. And also, if it's the case that you've experienced enough trauma and things like that, I mean, suicide's not the only way out. I just put it like that, It's partly why I'm writing the Secular Project. So the Secular Project is a philosophical treatise on basically secular morality and ethics, but It's really for people who have people who can't be Christian or people who can't be religious. Like they're not necessarily creative or anything like that. They just don't have, they don't feel like being religious for whatever reasons. It doesn't mean that people who don't want to be nihilist, there's people who don't want to be nihilist who are in that space. Creative people who can't be religious or don't want to be religious. Some creative people are religious. That's a thing because conscientiousness and all agreeableness and all those sorts of factors coalesce. And there are a lot of categories, but one of the categories for the people that I have in mind whenever I'm writing the secular project are those creatives who kill themselves. Not maybe necessarily people with personality disorders, but creatives who kill themselves. I think that that's a real tragic thing because, like, I don't know if it's necessarily tragic. It depends on why they killed themselves. Some creative people kill themselves because that's how they're gonna do it, and they're not gonna let the world tell them how to be. It's kind of like a self-righteous indignation or vengeance, which to me, I don't have a problem with those things. I don't think that that's necessarily immoral. So I don't mind that suicide, or they die for their ideals or something like that, or what they believe. I don't limit that suicide. But people like Virginia Woolf, where it seems more like they gave up and it swallowed them. That's those are the people that I'm writing the secular project for. And so that's the motivation behind this video. Same motivation for me writing the secular project is the same reason why I'm making this video. Because I think that if you want to resign, you just think like, there's a difference. There really is a difference. There's a way in which you can say, so you can either, I have the analogy of this, like, take the careers of Muhammad Ali in boxing and Barry Sanders in football. Barry Sanders, this is my hypothesis, was fed up with the Detroit Lions. He was one of the greatest running backs in all time. He felt like he had nothing else to prove to people, so he walked away, And he wasn't going to change the organization, and he wasn't going to change the media's perceptions of him, so he walked away. I think when people do suicide like that, I have no problem with it. I think that kind of suicide is heroic, because maybe the world doesn't deserve certain people at certain times. Maybe it just doesn't. Who's to say? But then there's Muhammad Ali, who seems like he couldn't walk away, even when he should have walked away. And because he didn't, it swallowed him, I guess like Muhammad Ali isn't the most tragic figure, to most people's eyes. But whenever I look at his Parkinson's, I think about it like that. It's something that creeped up on him because he wasn't in control of himself, and he wasn't necessarily. He may have been a disciplined boxer and things like that, but he was riding the hard line in a way that just wasn't best for his personality. That's what I would say. And so I'm not saying that everybody should live a long life or something like that, because I think if you die in battle, if it's indignation, if you're dying for your values, you should live dangerously. You definitely should live dangerously. But that doesn't mean that you should go away quietly into the night. That's to reference that poem. I don't think that that's a thing, because even if it doesn't mean that sadness can't compel you, because sadness should compel you to act in certain ways or something like that. But do it for yourself. Don't do it because of what everyone else has done to you, or however the world's treated you, or said something to you, or been towards you. And I know that may seem, how's that different from indignation? At least with indignation, it's the holy honor and value of self. That's what's being held up. Where when you're just throwing yourself into an ocean and drowning, that just means you've given up. And you've not just given up on life, you've given up on yourself. And to me, that's the most disheartening thing, because maybe other people aren't going to like you and aren't going to value you and things like that, but you should do it for yourself because you're owed that. I mean, you're owed that. And I guess that's just my own bias. But anyway, that's my video, and thank you for watching.